She stood there in the rain, not because she couldn't afford an umbrella, but because some pain is meant to be felt. Margaret Chen, 63 years old, billionaire, philanthropist, mother. And on that cold November morning, she was simply broken. She came to her son's grave the same way every year, same flowers, same time, same silence that never gave answers. But this time, something was different. As she knelt by the stone, her eyes blurred with tears, she heard it. A sob, not hers. Someone else was crying. Margaret turned her head slowly, and there, across the graveyard beneath a bare oak tree, stood a young black woman in her mid-20s, soaked to the bone, clutching a small child in her arms. The woman wasn't just crying, she was breaking. And Margaret didn't know why, but she couldn't look away. What happened next would shatter everything Margaret thought she knew about grief, about privilege, about love, and about the invisible walls we build between each other. This is a story about two women, two mothers, two worlds that should have never collided, but they did, and neither of them would ever be the same. Welcome to our Black Diary. Before we go deeper into this story, I want to ask you something. If stories like this, stories about us, about resilience, about the truth we don't always get to tell, if they matter to you, hit that subscribe button right now. It's free. It costs you nothing. But it helps us keep showing up here every single day with these stories, because our Black Diary isn't just a channel, it's a space, a witness, a mirror, and we need you here. Now let's go back to that graveyard. Margaret Chen wasn't supposed to cry anymore. At least that's what people expected. It had been 5 years since her son Daniel died. 5 years since the car accident that took him at 28. 5 years since the last time she heard him laugh, argue with her about business decisions, or tell her she worked too much. 5 years. And the world had moved on. Her company kept growing. Her charity galas kept happening. Her name kept appearing in Forbes lists and on bronze plaques in hospital wings. But Margaret was still stuck in that phone call, the one that came at 2:47 in the morning. The one that started with those words no parent should ever hear. She came to his grave every November 14th, his birthday. Rain or shine, alone, always alone. She'd bring white chrysanthemums, his favorite. She'd talk to the stone like he could hear her, tell him about the foundation she started in his name, about the scholarships, the work. She talked, but she never felt heard. And then she heard that cry. At first she thought maybe she was imagining it. Grief does that sometimes, makes you hear things, see things, feel things that aren't really there. But when she looked up, wiping rain from her eyes, she saw her. The young black woman, standing maybe 30 feet away, holding a child who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. The woman's clothes were drenched. Thin jacket, sneakers with holes. Her hair was pulled back in a bun that had come loose in the rain, and she was crying so hard her shoulders shook. Margaret didn't know what made her stand up, didn't know what made her walk toward this stranger. But she did, step by step, slowly, carefully. When she got close enough, the woman looked up, eyes red, swollen, full of something Margaret recognized instantly: devastation. Margaret's voice was soft, hesitant when she asked if the woman was okay. The stranger stared at her for a long moment, as if she didn't believe someone was actually speaking to her, as if she'd become invisible and had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she apologized for disturbing anyone. Margaret shook her head, told her she wasn't disturbing anyone, that she just looked like she needed help. The woman's face crumpled, fresh tears spilled over. She said she didn't even know what help looked like anymore. And that's when Margaret saw the gravestone the woman had been standing near. Elijah Thompson, born March 12th, died March 12th, the same day. The child had lived less than 24 hours. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the little girl in the woman's arms, alive, squirming, beautiful, and then back at the grave. And suddenly, she understood. This woman wasn't just grieving, she was surviving. Her name was Shayla Thompson, 26 years old, single mother, waitress at a diner on the south side of the city. And the child in her arms? That was Amara, 3 years old. Her miracle, her heartbeat. But before Amara, there was Elijah. Shayla had been 19 when she got pregnant the first time. Young, scared, but hopeful. She had dreams back then, wanted to be a nurse, wanted to help people, wanted to build something good. But life had other plans. The father left before the baby was born. Her mother was too sick to help, and Shayla worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over her head. She did everything right during that pregnancy, took her vitamins, went to every appointment she could afford, prayed every single night, and on March 12th, she went into labor. But something went wrong. The hospital was understaffed. The nurses were overwhelmed. And when Shayla started saying she felt something wasn't right, when she said the pain was different, when she begged someone to listen, they didn't. They told her it was normal, told her to breathe, told her she was overreacting. And by the time someone finally checked on her, it was too late. Elijah was born silent. She held him for 17 minutes. That's all she got. 17 minutes to memorize his face, to kiss his forehead, to whisper her apologies, and then they took him away. The hospital offered condolences. A social worker gave her a pamphlet on grief counseling she couldn't afford, and that was it. No investigation, no accountability, no justice, just silence. But Shayla didn't break, not completely, because 2 years later, she got pregnant again, and this time, she fought. She changed hospitals. She advocated for herself even when nurses dismissed her. She demanded to be heard. And on a rainy April morning, Amara came into the world screaming, alive. Shayla named her Amara. It means grace in Swahili, because that's what she was, a second chance, a reason to keep going. But even now, 3 years later, Shayla still came to Elijah's grave, because some children you carry in your arms, and some you carry forever in your chest. That's where Margaret found her that day, standing between grief and gratitude, between what was lost and what was saved. And when Margaret asked her quietly what had happened, Shayla told her, all of it. I need to pause here for just a moment, because if this story is hitting you the way it's hitting me, if you feel Shayla's pain, if you see yourself or someone you love in her fight, then do me a favor. Hit that like button, drop a comment. Tell me, have you ever felt unheard? Have you ever had to fight just to be believed? And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it tells the algorithm to keep pushing these stories to people who need them. Because this is what Our Black Diary is about. Not just telling stories, but making sure they're heard. Now, let's get back to Margaret and Shayla. Margaret stood there in the rain, listening to Shayla's story, and something inside her cracked. Not in a breaking way, in an opening way. Because for 5 years, she'd been drowning in her own grief, wrapped up in her own loss, living in a bubble of privilege where pain was private, where mourning was elegant, where suffering could be managed with therapy and time. But Shayla's grief was raw, public, unprotected. She didn't have the luxury of elegant mourning. She had to grieve and survive. Margaret didn't say anything for a long time. She just stood there, rain dripping off the edge of her coat, staring at this young woman who had lost so much and still kept showing up. Finally, she spoke. Told Shayla that she had lost her son too. Shayla looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. Said she was sorry. Margaret said she was too. And then, without thinking, without planning, Margaret did something she hadn't done in 5 years. She reached out and she hugged this stranger, this young black woman she didn't know, this mother who had survived what no mother should ever have to survive. She hugged her. And Shayla collapsed into it, because sometimes you don't need advice, you don't need solutions, you just need someone to see you. They stood there like that for a long time. 2 mothers, 2 gravesites, 2 worlds that weren't supposed to touch. But grief has a way of breaking down walls. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret wiped her eyes and looked at little Amara, who was staring up at her with wide, curious eyes. She told Shayla that her daughter was beautiful. Shayla said softly that she was everything. Margaret smiled, a real smile, the first one she'd felt in years. She asked the child's name. Amara, Shayla told her. Grace, Margaret whispered back. Shayla blinked, surprised. Margaret explained that her son had taught her. He'd been fascinated by languages, cultures, people. And then, quieter, she added that he would have liked Shayla. They exchanged numbers that day. Margaret insisted. She said she just wanted to check in, make sure Shayla was okay. But it became more than that. Over the next few weeks, Margaret and Shayla started texting. Little things at first. How's Amara? How are you holding up? Then Margaret started showing up at the diner where Shayla worked. not as a customer demanding service, but as a friend, sitting in the corner booth, ordering coffee, leaving tips that made Shayla's hands shake, $200 for a $6 meal, $500 for a $12 breakfast. Shayla tried to refuse, tried to say it was too much, but Margaret would just smile and say that no one could stop her from being generous. It was one of the few privileges she actually enjoyed. And slowly, something beautiful started to happen. Shayla began to open up about her dreams, about wanting to go back to school, about how she wished she could give Amara a better life. And Margaret? Margaret started to feel again. For 5 years, she'd been writing checks, funding scholarships, building wings on hospitals, but she'd never actually seen the people those checks were supposed to help. She'd never sat across from someone like Shayla and realized, this is who I'm supposed to be doing this for. One day, over coffee, Margaret asked a question she'd been holding on to for weeks. What would Shayla do if money wasn't an issue? If she could do anything? Shayla laughed. Not a bitter laugh, just tired. She said she'd go back to school, finish her nursing degree. She'd only had 1 year left when everything fell apart. Margaret nodded slowly, then asked what if she paid for it. Shayla froze, stared at her. Margaret repeated herself. What if she paid for her school, her books, childcare while she was in class, everything? Shayla shook her head, said she couldn't let her do that, but Margaret corrected her gently, said Shayla wasn't letting her. She was offering. There's a difference. Margaret's voice softened as she continued, told Shayla that she'd fought for her daughter when no one believed her, that she'd survived something that would have destroyed most people, and she was still here, still showing up, still dreaming. Margaret wanted to help her build that dream, and Shayla cried. Not sad tears this time, hopeful ones. If you're still with me right now, I need you to do something. I need you to subscribe. Not just for me, but for stories like Shayla's, for the mothers who fought and weren't believed, for the people who survived the impossible and still keep going. Our Black Diary exists because we exist, and we need you here to keep this space alive. So hit that subscribe button, drop a like, leave a comment telling me what you're feeling right now, because I promise you, this story isn't over yet. Shayla went back to school that fall. Margaret didn't just pay for tuition, she set up a trust fund for Amara's future. She connected Shayla with a network of professional women who mentored her. She made sure Shayla had everything she needed, not as charity, but as investment, because Margaret had learned something in those months. Grief doesn't go away when you ignore it. It goes away when you transform it. And for the first time since Daniel died, Margaret felt like she was honoring his memory in a way that mattered, not with buildings or scholarships that bore his name, but with presence, by showing up for someone who needed to be seen. Shayla graduated 18 months later, top of her class. Margaret was there in the audience, tears streaming down her face, clapping louder than anyone else. And when Shayla walked across that stage and accepted her nursing degree, she looked out into the crowd, found Margaret's eyes, and mouthed 2 words: thank you. But the story doesn't end there, because Shayla didn't just become a nurse, she became an advocate. She started working in maternal health, specifically in underserved communities, specifically fighting for Black mothers who weren't being heard, just like she hadn't been heard. She testified before hospital boards, she pushed for policy changes, she trained nurses on implicit bias, and every single time someone tried to dismiss a mother's pain, Shayla was there, reminding them to listen. Just listen. It could save a life. And Margaret restructured her entire foundation. She stopped funding generic hospital wings and started funding programs that addressed maternal mortality in Black communities. She partnered with Shayla to create training initiatives. She used her platform and her privilege to amplify voices that had been silenced. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because she'd learned something that day in the graveyard. Grief connects us, but action heals us. Years later, on a warm spring afternoon, Margaret and Shayla stood together at Elijah's grave. This time, they weren't crying. They were planting flowers. Amara, now 7 years old, helped dig the small holes in the dirt, chattering about school and her friends and how she wanted to be a doctor when she grew up. She asked her mother if her brother would be proud of her. Shayla knelt down, cupped her daughter's face gently, and told her that she knew he was. Margaret watched them, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. And she thought about Daniel, about the son she lost, about the dreams he had for making the world better. And she realized he was making the world better. Through her, through Shayla, through every mother they helped, every life they saved. Loss doesn't end, but it can become something else. It can become purpose. There's a moment in every story where you have to step back and ask, what does this all mean? Why does it matter? And here's what I think. Margaret and Shayla's story isn't just about two women who met by chance. It's about what happens when we stop seeing people as statistics and start seeing them as human. It's about what happens when privilege meets pain and chooses connection over comfort. It's about what happens when grief stops being something we carry alone and becomes something we transform together. Shayla could have stayed invisible. Another young black mother working 3 jobs, another woman whose pain was dismissed, another statistic in the maternal mortality crisis. But Margaret saw her, and that seeing changed everything. And here's the thing we don't talk about enough. Seeing someone isn't passive, it's active. It's choosing to stop, to listen, to care, to act. It's choosing to say, your pain matters, your story matters, you matter. Margaret didn't save Shayla. Shayla saved herself. But Margaret made space for that saving to happen. She made space for hope, for healing, for transformation. And that's what we all have the power to do. We can't fix everything. We can't undo loss. But we can show up. We can see people. We can listen when they speak. We can believe them when they say something's wrong. We can act when action is needed. That's not charity. That's humanity. And it's the most powerful thing we have. All right, family. Before we close this out, I need to ask you one more time. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently, feel deeper, see clearer, subscribe to our Black Diary. Not because I'm begging, but because stories like this need to be told, and they need you here to make sure they're heard. Hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever been the person who wasn't seen? Or have you been the person who stopped to see someone else? What did that moment teach you? I read every single comment, and your stories matter just as much as the ones I tell. So don't hold back. This is our space, our diary. Let's fill it together. Margaret still visits Daniel's grave every November 14th, but now she doesn't go alone. Shayla comes with her, and Amara, and sometimes other mothers they've helped along the way. They bring flowers, they share stories, they laugh, they cry, they remember, because that's what we do in our Black Diary. We remember the pain, but we also remember the people, the fighters, the survivors, the ones who turned grief into grace. Shayla and Margaret taught us something that day in the graveyard, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is just see them, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let yourself be seen. Thank you for being here. Thank you for seeing these stories. Thank you for being part of our Black Diary. Until next time, keep showing up, keep seeing each other, keep believing each other. We'll be here tomorrow with another story, another truth, another piece of us.